Hello and welcome to TidyX episode 91. TidyX is a screencast where we go through and explain how our code works. My name is Ellis Hughes. You can find me on Twitter at Ellis_Hughes.
And my name's Patrick Ward. You can find me on Twitter at OSPPatrick. Tidy Explained on Twitter at Tidy_Explained. Tidy Explained at Gmail at tidy.explained@gmail.com. Open up a issue on the GitHub repo if you'd like, or hit us up on YouTube. Like and subscribe, drop a comment in. Seems to be the easiest way that people like to interact.
Yep, and we're loving to hear from y'all. We've gotten a lot of excitement and comments lately, so thank you for your feedback. We always appreciate hearing about it. Also, we have a Patreon page. If you like what we're doing and like to support what we're doing, please consider becoming a patron. Once again, we do this all for free. Try to share this out with you. But if you want us to continue and like to support us doing it, please consider being a patron. All right, episode 91. So last week, episode 90, we did an episode talking about Rmarkdown and doing an introduction to like Markdown syntax, how you set that up, how Markdown moves into Rmarkdown, where we have the idea of these R chunks that behave like R script pieces that can run like normal R code and produce outputs. And so that is kind of what we covered last week. If you're just seeing this video now and you want to learn a little bit more about that, go watch that episode. We're going to pick up where we left off, which is talking a little bit about the R chunks and how they work. Patrick, do you want to share anything as I share the screen?
Yep, this will be a really important screencast for those of you trying to build kind of functional reports that you want people to see, because controlling the way that chunks behave is ultimately going to control how your report looks with regards to whether you want to show code, whether you want to show outputs, whether you want to show code with no outputs. Maybe you're teaching a class or giving a lecture or something like that. Controlling the code chunks is essential to kind of crafting the message that you want to tell with your Markdown file, where you want the figures to go, how big they should be, all of that kind of stuff. We're going to cover that today.
Yes. All right. Perfect. So, like I said, we're going to pick up where we left off last week, which is code chunks. And so, as we said, the R code chunks is denoted as 3 ticks, followed by a curly brace, then the letter in lowercase r, and then another curly brace. And you write any code you want to your heart's desire that is runnable R code, or code that would be run in a normal R script or in the R console. Then, to denote that you're done writing your R code, you'd like to go back to writing normal Markdown, you denote that with 3 ticks. And so this is what's known as a code chunk. And this is about as standard as it gets. This is the most basic way that you can tell Knitr and Rmarkdown that this is a code chunk that I want to be evaluated as R code. But as Patrick alluded to, there are a lot of options that you can set to this that will change its behavior. And this is really important information and really important as you're creating your reports to know. We're going to only talk about a small subset of the total available chunk options that exist. If you want to learn more, you can go to the author of Knitr in his website, ua.org, and under his package Knitr, he has this section called options. And this lists all the various options and in a lot of detail explaining
a lot of options.
how all of these different things behave, how he expects people to use them, some examples. So you should definitely check this piece out if you want to learn more than the basics. We will be, as we move forward in this series, probably covering a few of these, but there are just so many functionally we cannot cover all of them. We are going to cover what we think are the most commonly used ones. And so let's get going with that. So first, the options you can set. You can give a chunk a unique chunk name. And so what that unique chunk name indicates is as you're processing the R Markdown, it's going to show you, hey, I'm running this chunk name, and this is how far along I am in executing the code. And this is helpful for a couple reasons. First, you're able to, when you're editing your own R Markdown script, you're able to go, and you're collaborating with somebody else, you can tell them, hey, I'm in chunk titled regression cars. or whatever, and they automatically are able to go to that same chunk without having to understand more about the structure of your code. Importantly, you can't have any spaces in the chunk name, and really don't suggest using underscores. Use dashes, and this is for how that chunk name gets used later on in some processing. Next, there is an incredibly common chunk option called echo. And so echo is a Boolean, so it's either true or false. And what that does is it specifies whether you want the code that is in this code chunk to be shared. So by default, most of the time this is going to be set to true, which means when you render your Rmarkdown report, the code that is in that code chunk will be displayed in your output for people to look at. So actually often I will set that to be false, because usually when I'm creating an Rmarkdown report, I'm actually not trying to share the code, I'm trying to share the outputs. Next is include. So this option indicates whether you want to include the output of your code or not. So I don't think I use this very often, but it might be a case of like you're trying to produce things, but they sometimes produce, you're running code, but they have side effects where they produce some sort of output, some sort of message, some sort of information that is useful when you're programming. But once again, in your report, this isn't very helpful. You don't really need to be sharing how far the burn-in in your Monte Carlo has gone or something like that. I don't know. I'm coming up with examples here. Like that's not really useful. You only care about the end result, right? And so this is a Boolean as well. It's set to true or false. Probably you're going to set this to be true most of the time. Or it's going to, by default, it is true. But you can set that. Next we have eval, which is also a Boolean, and this is indicating whether that code chunk should even be run when your R code is being, or when the R Markdown document is being evaluated and running through that. So it'll look to see is eval true, and if it's true, that means it will run that R chunk, but if it's false, it will just skip it altogether. And so this is a way to, if you want to share R code, but you don't want it to be run, you can set echo to true, so it'll share the R code, but eval to false. And so this could be like you have some potentially long-running code that you want to show this is how it would look like, this is how I structure the code, but I don't actually want to run it for the purposes of generating this report, as an example. And then you have two additional warnings that I find actually pretty commonly, which is warning and message. These are also both Booleans, and these indicate whether you want the output to include the messages from your code or the warnings from your code in the output as well. More than likely, you're probably going to want to set these to be false, but there could be scenarios where this is valuable. And so you can already see, here is an example. Let me actually zoom in a little bit. Zoom in a little bit more to show you how this would look when you're setting it in an R chunk. So you once again have those three ticks. You have the curly brace. You have the curly brace R, which is indicating you're running R code. You have the title, and you don't have to set title equals. It's just that first argument is expected to be title. And then you separate all the different chunk options with commas, and it's the chunk option and then whatever value it intends to do. It all needs to be on a single line. And so that is an interesting piece as well, is that you can't do something like that because now it's no longer an R chunk. It all needs to be in a single line here where we set all these things. So for this R chunk here, its title is regression cars. It won't show the code because echo is false, but we will include the outputs. It will be evaluated. It won't show any warnings if any warnings were to be generated by our R code, but any messages that were to be generated potentially would be included in our output. And this is set on a chunk by chunk basis. But you can imagine if you want to have a bunch of code that you do plan on evaluating but don't want to show the R code, this could be potentially really annoying, right? To have to go through every single R chunk and set echo to be false. Patrick, is there another way?
You can use knitter to basically set the chunks of, basically set the parameters that you want for all of the chunks going forward. With knitter ops underscore chunk $set, This takes all of those arguments that you would normally put in the little R area there at the start of the chunk. And this is basically saying, hey, I'm going to be writing this report and I want every single chunk to be evaluated this same way. So really now the only thing you have to do going forward is within the curly braces of R, really just pass it the title that you want for that chunk. Everything else going forward from this point is going to be evaluated to say echo equals false. So don't return any code. Include equals true. So give me the output of whatever happens, whether it's a model output or a plot or a figure. Don't show me any of the warnings that might be generated, and don't show me any of the messages that might be generated. And now this is going to be standard fare going forward.
So all your R chunks after the point at which this is set will be using these options. And so this is why up here I needed to set this, because this hadn't been set globally yet. And so it's
when
only
you
at the point that it gets evaluated.
and when you open a new Markdown file, the first chunk by default that they give you will have this little knitter argument. And so essentially you just delete everything from 11 down and you set your parameters and then you're pretty much ready to roll.
Yep, so you might want to do that. Include equals true.
The other thing to know with this is that you're setting those parameters right there in line 9. But for this chunk itself, you can override those for this chunk itself only. You can override those with that up there. So for example, if you wanted to, echo equals true, like maybe you're teaching a course and you want to say like, hey, I'm going to show you how to set your code parameters and I'll show you the code, right? So
Exactly. So this could be useful for like you're generating, like if you're a teacher, I don't know, that's just generating like an output and say, hey, get to this output. And here's the input data and then the answer key. And it's super simple to then switch echo to be true for all your arguments, and then it'll produce all those outputs.
Yeah.
All right, so now we've got some general options for code. And this is general. You can apply this to nearly all of your R chunks and without worrying too much. Or you don't have to worry about this. Like you set this works on all your R chunks. But as we've alluded to, there's outputs that you can have from your R chunks that aren't just like the standard text or like console output you might see. For example, figures. So what your R code, a lot of the time people are going to be using R to generate figures or images or plots and whatnot that are incredibly valuable. In fact, at least in my industry, R was known or used commonly to produce outputs. We're gaining gaining use in other areas as well, but it's known for producing really high quality images. So you can, just like we were setting for code itself, you can specify any plots that are generated from this R chunk here. We can specify specific behavior for figures as well. And so there's lots of different options. If you want to learn more about that, go to UA's website and you'll learn a lot about those. But there's 4 arguments that I find that I use all the time when I'm dealing with figure outputs in my reports. And that's fig width, which is specifying the width in inches, so it has to be a numeric value that I want the plot to be, or the figure output to be. Fig height, same idea, but this time it's specifying the height. Fig cap is specifying the caption for the figure. And so this is useful, so you don't have to try to manually add this back in. You just specify, hey, I'm going to be producing a plot from this this R chunk here, and this is the caption I want to be included in that output. And then finally, fig.align, which is going to be specifying where you want your figure to be aligned in the output. I think by default it's left aligned, but you can specify center, right, or I think there might be a couple different options. Yeah, default, left, right, center. And so here I'm specifying I want it to be centered in the output. And so then it'll just create a plot. And this is a base R plot, but it does work for any sort of plot output. So let me quickly render this output here. Let me open in a browser because then it'll look a little bit nicer. Just because it's not as zoomed in. But yes, so this is the R code that we went through. And as you can see here, by default, we didn't set echo to be false. So we have cases where the R code that was being run that generates an output is being shared. So this is like your standard plot of cars. This is the very first R chunk that we have, showing the plot for cars as well as the linear regression of dist on speed from the cars data set. And so this is the linear model that gets generated. Here, now you'll see that we only have, you'll remember that in this chunk here, we specified echo to be false. So now the R code didn't get printed, but the output did. So this is different than this piece here, even though the code was the same. Next, we have our figure outputs, and here this time we specified the figure width and the alignment, which is now different than this guy, because this guy's left aligned and it's bigger. Here, now it's square, because we didn't specify a height. I think it assumes that it's square, and then it's centered in our output. There we go. So that's some pretty basic figure options that most people would be assigning. But let's take this to the next step. Let's actually show you some potential real code that would be useful. So let me close that. And Patrick, do you want to take us through this code?
Yeah, so let's take a look at some basic NBA stats. So we'll scrape a little data here. What you'll notice is, again, right at the top of this, I've set some of the chunk options for that first chunk, and then I've set the knitter options for all of the ensuing chunks, just basically echoing to be true. Here at line 11, where I load the packages, this is something I do for every one of my markdowns. And it is sometimes when you set in the code chunk that warnings and messages should be false, it doesn't always pick up everything. For like tidyverse, you're going to get an output of the dependencies all the time. So I go in and I explicitly manually set this with these two functions. The first one is set package startup messages, and I pass it the curly braces inside of the parentheses because I'm going to pass another function inside of that, which is suppress warnings, curly braces, and then I load all of my packages, and then I close both of those up. And this is manually saying like, hey, for these packages, for everything within those second curly braces, I don't want to see any of that stuff. So I make sure I get rid of all of that. All right. I'm going to set the theme to light just so that it looks kind of nice. I'm going to scrape some data. I'm not going to go through this code. We've done this a million times. So I'm just going to scrape some of the NBA data from basketballreference.com. I'll scrape one of the tables that has the team stats, and we're going to pull it into a data frame here that we're going to call DF.
Let me actually run all this code. Also, one other nice thing about using Rmarkdown in RStudio is that it has these little toggles here, and this isn't like standard. This is RStudio being incredibly smart, going gears. So this is how we could modify our chunk outputs, and then it's got this little play button where you can click on that, and it'll automatically run all the code in that chunk.
That chunk, yeah.
And so now we've run all this, and we have our DF object. Lots of stuff here.
And now I'm just going to produce a simple plot. It's an XY plot of offensive and defensive rebounds by team. So within this code chunk, we're going to say echo equals false. We don't want to return our ggplot code. Sometimes you might want to do that if you're like teaching or something like that. But in this case, we're not going to do that. We're going to set a nice little figure caption. Then we're going to call it offensive and defensive rebounds for each team. And then I'm going to just make a simple ggplot here. This is all the standard ggplot stuff that we've done before, where we have an x-axis and a y-axis as the offensive and defensive rebounds. We're going to plot each team as a point on the graph. We're going to set a V line and H line. So basically, we're going to create some crosshairs that show us the averages for both of those respective statistics. And then I'm going to use the ggRepel package to put the team labels basically right in line with the points with the geom points. So basically there will be a little line pointing to each one, connecting each team to their respective dot within the average offensive and defensive rebound. And so there we can see it there. We see each team and we see the average lines and we see where everybody's kind of lies. And when we knit this, it'll come out as a little bit nicer of a picture because it'll be on a bigger canvas than what we can get in the RStudio browser there. And so now we have a quick little NBA report. We have some teams. We could obviously write some text underneath, et cetera, et cetera. We'll expand on this in future episodes with different things that you can do. And these things, this is really cool because like if you're doing this as an HTML, you can use Plotly in this, and you could make interactive plots and things. So we'll go over all that kind of stuff as we sort of expand our Markdown arsenal over the next few episodes.
Yeah, basically this is infinitely flexible. It's infinitely expandable. You can keep on adding chunks to this and produce a really nice report. And the nice thing also is that it's completely reproducible. You can run this code 1,000 times. It's always going to produce the same output for you. I mean, I guess there might be slight differences because this is a somewhat random process, but you could set a seed or something along those lines. But
I think you could actually set a seed inside of the chunk options, I believe. Is there a seed set? I can't remember. No, maybe not. For some reason I thought there was, but I guess
I don't know. Like we said, and the nice thing also about RStudio is it's got a lot of it pre-populates some options for you here too. So that is the nice thing as well. So with that, I think that is a high-level overview of how you can set some of your basic code chunk options as well as figure chunk options. That these are the ones that I use very regularly. Obviously there's a lot of other options and they're all very useful for very different reasons. But this is like the ones you gotta know right now. So with that, I think we're going to end the episode right now. So thank you all for joining us. As always, my name is Ellis Hughes. You can find me on Twitter at Ellis_Hughes.
And my name is Patrick Ward. You can find me on Twitter at OSPPatrick. Tidy Explained on Twitter at Tidy_Explained. Tidy Explained on Gmail at tidy.explained@gmail.com. Of course, you can go to the GitHub page and open up a issue. Or you can hit us up on YouTube, like and subscribe, and drop a comment below the video. We appreciate hearing from you.
Thank you all so much. And if you wouldn't mind considering becoming a patron on Patreon, we'd also really appreciate that as well. Thank you all so much. You keep on exploring your world.